I really have the enormous pleasure, and I'm eternally grateful to have the colleagues that I have. We have a very small department. There's, well, depending on how you count, 5 of us as full-time faculty. And miraculously, we all get along. I don't think we've ever had a fight, or even really an eye roll. I think there's just a deep amount of admiration and respect and support. This was a 2-year endeavor. We've never done an academic conference before, so we were all virgins and certainly out of our depth. And it was such a pleasure to work with them and to have these kind of bi-weekly dinners and really try and hammer out, in a way, a different attempt at trying to do some sort of an academic conference. In some ways, an unconference. And there were a lot of early discussions about how to do it, how to frame it. We've all certainly been to, well, they'll go unnamed, but we'd certainly been to enough academic conferences where we were bored to tears and didn't want to replicate that experience for ourselves or for anyone else. And so we had a lot of conversations early on about how to do something that had enough structure that it wouldn't fail fundamentally, but that could be open-ended enough and potentially even feral enough to surprise everyone. And for everyone to kind of walk away with some sense of maybe a bit of a fire in your ass to try and carve out a new train. And hopefully, I mean, I certainly feel that way, and if anyone else in the room feels that way, it's maybe at least a small beginning. And so, to all of my colleagues, to the administration that supports us, thank you. And then also to all of the participants, the moderators, the presenters. I've been utterly bewitched by every last one of you, which I can't even say that that's ever happened before. There's usually some kind of flat spot somewhere in an event. I haven't detected one. And so I think we're enormously fortunate that we managed to somehow draw incredible minds and incredibly generous people in our midst. And so Rossen and I are actually going to attempt to somehow, I don't know that we're going to summarize anything. I think if anything we might pull up in that chart. And we're going to introduce each other. And I've recently gotten, I think, to the point in my life where I'd love to introduce people, but not in conventional ways. Rossen happens to be my dearest friend on planet Earth. And we certainly are in a kind of perpetual high-level conversation with one another, but we've never actually talked in public like this before. So this is a new modality for us, which is kind of exciting. And I thought maybe I would tell you some things about him that you may or may not know, because you certainly have access to the credentials. He, I think, is probably the most brilliant person I've ever met, hands down, and also has the most generous intellect. I've never seen him make anyone feel small by his brilliance. And that's an incredibly rare thing, because usually people will leverage that against you. And I think the other thing that I can say is, being my closest friend, there's a couple of things that I have learned, and I would encourage all of you to try and seek these things out in life. And then one of them is that it's an enormous asset to have your dearest friend be a philosopher, and one who specializes in both ethics and aesthetics, especially someone that's an artist. And so my own kind of emotional, professional, kind of human development has increased exponentially because of the world that he inhabits and the way that he thinks about things. And in moments of life crisis, there is no better person to have at your side than someone who can kind of pull the ethical debate, human debate out and reframe your small trauma in relationship to it. And so go out and find a philosopher to be your dearest friend. It's really helpful. And the other thing I will say is, when we were planning this, we had a lot of conversations about how to identify, how to talk about things that we don't talk about, right? How do you know you have a blind spot, and then if you can identify it, what you do with it. And one thing that I realized is that you need trust and you need intimacy. And I felt that in the room in the last day and a half, that we entrusted each other enough to be able to talk about issues that maybe outside of these walls we might wince at a bit, or people might wince at us. You know, Annie Kogan mentioned something about how she never dared to show any of that research to her students, you know, and hopefully now maybe she will. And so I would say that that's something also that that Rossen and I, and certainly my other colleagues at Woodbury and other colleagues kind of across the country and around the world share, is that there is a kind of implicit trust that we might fumble to be elegant or articulate in the search for new knowledge or scholarship, and that we always understand one's best intentions in trying to do that, and it seems like that's in the room. So.
There's a little sticker on my microphone, and it's the letter G, so you made me feel like a gangster. What do I say? First of all, one housekeeping thing. The reason I'm facing a little bit this way is because I'm enamored with our little slideshow, so I beg Kevin to be able to see what we project. So I'm sorry to anyone that I'm not facing directly. Well, thank you. But thank you all, actually, for making this impossible for the two of us. I was joking to someone earlier, but it ain't a joke, that this type of thing, you know, sort of like a final closing remarks is usually an attempt to tie the loose ends of whatever event, respectively, and in our case, we are the loose ends, because everything else is so tight. I mean, I'm so impressed, and it's interesting to have apprehended people's careers in the abstract before we actually met, before this had happened, and then to have seen it play out in this beautiful way. But back to our lengthy introduction, the Peterson. I mean, an astonishing friend, obviously, and my PR agent, apparently. So there's two things that I wanted to share which are super intimate, and one of them is probably knowledge that is available to some of her students and colleagues, but it's not widely available to the world out there. She has the most uncanny handwriting. If you saw the way this artist, educator, and interior architect, and thinker, and amazing friend writes, you will be flabbergasted. It is, if a hummingbird wrote, it would look like what she does. And it's right here, actually. It's in my vicinity. I will never be able to get over that. Please flock upon her after that we finish to apprehend it. The second thing is that at some point she was given as a gift the mummies of a mouse and a cat. And she kept them jealously in her immediate physical vicinity in her house as a bit of a test for the people that were coming to her house to see their reaction. So, in the context of Unmentionables, when this was conceptualized as an event or as a series of talks, there was a sense of troublemaking, and I hope that this has come through for all of you listening and speaking. I certainly enjoyed myself, and I was you could probably hear me laughing and sort of clapping and rejoicing in my body language. Now I'm able to thank everyone for not only bringing their A game, but also their suspect game. There's a lot of notions that we planning to sort of throw about in a bit that are controversial not only in philosophy, which is my subject, but also in the world as we live it and as we know it, and the world of design as it tries to grapple with the human condition. So I guess we can just start topically.
Yeah. So we didn't really have any format in mind. We thought we would just start running off at the mouth and see where we end up. But we will invite you to heckle or intrude, or if you feel really passionate about inserting yourself into the conversation, please do so. And if it feels natural at some point to kind of turn things inside out and start to have more of a dialogue across all of us, we can certainly do that. So we'll just see where we end up, I guess. So one thing that I thought maybe we might do just to try and introduce a bit of a scaffold was to try and identify a series of types of things, maybe reasons why, or logics behind why things go undiscussed. And I'm not necessarily going to suggest that these are sort of rigid types. In fact, it's probably not even nearly inclusive, maybe not even correct. So I've identified 5. And I think that they're really braided together to some extent. You can't kind of pull them apart. The first I would, or they're not even necessarily in order, but the first one that I'll talk about is the ethical. So, are there things that we resist discussing because of a fear of somehow arguing into barbarism or monstrosity? This notion that it's, that we need either a certain kind of historical distance as solved to be able to begin to discuss them, or that it's too soon, right? Albert Speer is, for me, always the kind of litmus test. It's like, can we talk about Speer yet? No. It's not, we need another 50 years before we can even think about that. So there's this kind of ethical dimension. And I think that certainly the Mars presentation gets into some of that. What are the ethics of space travel, first of all, in terms of just the sort of scale of economy that it takes to even do that? Is there even a kind of huge ethical quagmire on the front end? And then when you get into issues of colonization, the quicksand gets real deep. And so that becomes really kind of fascinating. I think another typology is obviously one maybe that prevailed today, which is notions of the aesthetic. So issues of taste and style. How do we make determinations about where proper taste begins and ends? Are these sort of feathered, graduated edges, or are there kind of clear distinctions between things? And then what are the kind of the determining factors for that at any given moment, whether they're historical, cultural, or otherwise? And when we talk about things being kind of officially sanctioned within a discipline, just being, yes, we can talk about that, but 3 degrees over to the right, things get dicey and we don't want to go there. And so I think that's one other kind of condition of why things may or may not be discussed at any moment. Another one is actually purely functional, which is that life is finite, and at any given moment, any one of us can only hold so many things in our head, and we can only talk about so many things, and we can only be interested in so many things. And then the degree to which we align with others in building constituencies that then, of course, have political dimensions is another part of this, that you just can't possibly attend to everything all the time. And so how things just cycle through from purely practical or kind of functional perspectives is another issue, I think, which gets into notions of the forgotten moment. An additional one would be the ineffable, that there are simply things that exist beyond the capacities of language, or its verbal language. And there are certainly things within the constructed environment that are non-visual and pre-verbal, and so how we then find methods by which to enter into dialogue about these things, or to even be able to enunciate and identify them. And then the last one, which is maybe kind of where we end up here in Beckonings, is notions of the uncharted. And so the great risk of falling into the position of a dilettante or a kind of rank amateur, and how you may or may not put your credentials and your kind of professional license on the line at the risk of trying to dare to go somewhere. And there's I don't know if it's actually a great book because I've never read it, and ironically enough, the title of it is How to Talk About Books That You Haven't Read by Pierre Bayard. And I think it's like, it sort of gets at the notion of the fundamental condition of all design work, which is that you're always endeavoring to pre-vision something that doesn't yet exist. And how the hell do you do that? And so the way that you have to kind of reconcile the potential for shame or embarrassment or naivete or any of these other kinds of things that we tend to try and engineer out of the experience of designing work, whether that's text or whether that's physical things or so maybe this helps us get started. I don't know, there's so many places to enter that, but
I'm looking at a butterfly.
so yeah, that's always a place to start. Or to end.
Well, I guess, I mean, I think it makes sense to sort of tackle some of these notions in order, and then see if we run out of time, then we can continue on with some winding hand. But what I sort of call the theorist is the ethical and aesthetic, which is what Kelly was mentioning earlier. Because that's my training. You sort of like have to go to graduate school and write these long papers about why Kant was an unpleasant man. Literally, I did have to write a paper about this. It's sort of like a meta study of someone who is so important for philosophical ethics. But it's interesting because, I mean, the Mars video immediately made me sort of cringe. Where are you going? Don't leave us, right? And then Paulette kind of recovered that territory by claiming immediately that she's not going, and she's sort of... I think we live in a well-balanced world, or at least room. But I also thought of the unsavory characters that have millions of dollars that are able to do this, so you're going to be in very strange company. Many presentations today made me think of sort of, I mean, even curtain presentation, and a lot of the stuff everybody was talking about assumes a fragility of the human condition, right? Some kind of porousness in how passive we are to the contingencies of our environment and our histories. And so I think that's where the ethical comes in, basically, because when you talk about these thin surfaces that are supposed to protect us or supposed to engineer a visual field or re-inscribe a personal narrative, which is what design very often does, inadvertently or otherwise, then you are assuming the fragility of the human condition, right? And then the question of what's right or wrong to do becomes philosophical as much as it is a question of designing and building and so forth, right? And I don't know that I have, I mean, ideally I would have questions for the presenter so we can, continue topically. But if I have to retreat into my own discipline, I have to say that I feel safer at the end of this day than I did earlier this morning, in the sense that the exploration of these, untouchable territories and these the various veils that protect us from the world is an important ethical exploit, and I see a vibrant interest in it, even though it's not, advertised as a philosophical enterprise, right? And I was actually talking earlier to someone, and they asked me, had a flood. They asked me what my relationship to architecture is and how that came about, or the design world generally. And so I had to sort of justify my existence in this room. But then I could have just been rude and said, look at all of them. You don't have to justify anything. We're all complicit. I mean, we had a panel with, last night with a writer, a movie set production designer, and then an artist. So that makes me feel at home in this particular modality, and it helps me draw philosophical insight from the projects.
What about the aesthetic?
See, I'm put on the spot.
I'm just pulling your cord and letting you go. That's what's happening.
It's, yeah, well, it's easy, especially in the presence of coffee. So, I mean, the issue of taste, right? So I mentioned Immanuel Kant, and there was two mentions of Bourdieu today, right? So there's, sort of the socializing of taste, and the fact that, our, class, as in, political class, and our belonging to certain strata of society, demarcates a territory of taste, and then a sanction of it. And someone just threw it up in the air, and this was some, it's sort of like an easy catch for a philosopher. Someone just said, well, there wouldn't be any other alternative, right? Of course there is. The alternative is what Immanuel Kant proposed, which is that taste is a matter of subjective universality, and it has nothing to do with your social condition. And the way you socialize taste is by claiming everybody else's agreement on the stuff you like. So Kant, a white German man, a couple of centuries ago, who never left the town he lived in, proposed that all that taste was about was some kind of subjective reaction that you then imposed on others and demanded that others agree with. And that's sort of the short of, the critique of judgment, right? I mean, of course, there's many pages of details. And so it's interesting because the code for objectivity in the Kantian project is that we will all agree somehow. We will basically be able to, when I say, oh, I love, this photo or, this project, how controversial, then I'm basically asking for communion. I'm pleading to you in a way, right? I mean, and it could be considered, an intrusion, or it could be considered an invitation. But in both cases, it's a way of socializing judgment, right? Now, it's very different when we go with Bourdieu and say, hey, taste is actually a matter of social class. And where we were talking about some of the, the sanction of inferiors, right? And the fact that we're able to laugh at these advertisements precisely because we have that kind of twist of education. We have that extra level of sort of meta level of appreciation where it's ridiculous and therefore amazing, and I actually want it in my house now. That's socially determined, right? And it sort of like gets away from the Kantian demand on others to agree with you. It actually becomes a way of, segregating or separating oneself. And this is, it's a terrible place for a maker to be in, for a designer to be in, or for anyone else, because these lines do exist, and we do, there's a horror, and Arthur Danto spoke about this horror in the context of expressionist art and conceptual art. There is a horror that the same object could be looked upon by two different people in such different ways, right? This is sort of like, the apprehension in the political sense of today's United States, the apprehension that there is a legitimate other, an essential other, right? And this is what probably has scared the shit out of everybody around November last year, right? And when I say everybody, I'm speaking normatively, right? I'm already saying it to you, because it's of course not everybody, it's just some of us, right? And so it's a danger to think of taste, to think of the sanction of beauty as a social phenomenon. But it's also a danger to go with Kant and imagine that my subjective judgment could ever be communicated, could ever be shared, could ever be imposed or invited into by means of its essential structure. Right? So I'm gesturing at the tension here and just reminding the room, as I was reminded that there is that alternative, but it's probably equally untenable or equally unsavory, right? So taste remains a tool for division, maybe. And it's funny because even Bourdieu himself, but certainly many neo-Marxist scholars, Adorno is a good example, think of taste as a political barrier, right? Because to discern is to differentiate. to differentiate is to distance oneself. To distance oneself is to disappear up one's ass.
I was reminded so many times today about the fundamental instability of all the things that we do. Meaning that in any given moment, what we sometimes think of as history and therefore maybe as authoritative, definitive, is always in a way kind of mythology. And I was thinking, for whatever reason, maybe I can trace the genealogy when I talk through it a bit more. When Marty was presenting about this notion of a curtain, it's not that the curtain was never there, right? It's that suddenly we're reframing and sort of shifting the focus so that we're seeing it and we're allowing it to kind of register the conditions of that project suddenly in a very different way. And it reminded me a lot of, say, in the 18th century, the kind of polychromatic debate that happened in Europe when, particularly all of these sort of German, most of them are architects, they weren't quite archaeologists yet, because that wasn't, I think, totally codified as its own unique discipline yet. But they're going down to the Italian peninsula, they're starting to dig around in Pompeii, and they get far enough down underground and they realize, oh shit, this stuff was actually colored. And all of our presumptions, all of our neoclassical presumptions are incorrect. They're wrong. And so all these sort of like central tenets of neoclassicism get the rug pulled out from under them, and they freaked out. They wrote all these treatises that were literally called like, what ought we to do? So they're in this kind of existential crisis. And the same thing happened again in the 20th century with the early Corbusian villas, where color reproduction existed, but it was inordinately expensive. And so all of Corbusian's early villas were published in black and white, and the presumption was that they were white. And I think I'd be shocked if anyone in this room has never seen color photographs of Ventzislavov. Of course, we know that it wasn't. And so there was this kind of weird cycling back to the same pathology again. And so one thing that I think gets posed in a room like this with people like all of you is that these the kind of self-awareness of these mythologies becomes a kind of affront in the sense that they are a threat as kind of yet to be organized power. That there's actually really potent, deep-running ideas in the notion of things like the curtain or these kind of skin-like envelopes or it's so deeply threatening to the discipline for, say, Virginia to be looking at, like, a cake or, ombre hair coloring as a potential source for really serious design work. And so the question then is why? Why not? And so I think it's really brave, actually, to put these things out there because they're either totally unconsidered, or severely under-theorized, or it's overly burdensome to be the first one to pioneer the research, which I kind of get the sense that Courtney was sort of up against a bit, right? Like, even finding legitimate primary documentation on these things, like, has anyone ever actually written about them? Have they ever been taken seriously in a kind of academic context? And so, it takes some real moxie to be someone that's willing to do that.
Can I heckle them for a second?
Yeah, I need a microphone. Or come up here and sit with us and heckle us in very close proximity.
Maybe it's not so much a heckle, but I think one of the things that I found interesting about the symposium prompt right away was how to engage in a topic that is outside of a canon without feeling like the kid that got picked last on the kickball team, right? Without being reactionary or having, some kind of arms crossed attitude about it. Because often, we were talking at lunch, you sort of see this same presentation presentations at a lot of symposiums around town, sort of same politics. So finally, it's refreshing to see, well, not that, but it's refreshing to see.
We could not do it, I'm sorry.
I guess, how to have maybe grace in a way that to talk about those things without explicitly saying, well, if you're going to talk about that, we're going to go talk about this, and really dividing it into different camps. I think that is truly the challenge, and I think today it was fantastic to see that it didn't feel like that reactionary in that sense. But I think that is sort of the sweet spot, is trying to find that, how to do that. But I don't know.
I think what got me really excited is that we have a good mix between, historical conceptual projects or presentations, and then these sort of presentations that were descriptive of real work, tangible work, PNs and Molly's. So this really was a lot. That was also a lot of fun to see sort of that incendiary, that kind of risk-taking that we were probably going to expound on in a bit, in action, right? So I think that puts us in a comfortable place in terms of being last on the team. I don't know what kind of sports you were referring to. I'm not very good at sports. I'm not It sounds like what the world out there calls football. I'm being difficult. I do need another prompt. Well,
there was one thing I was thinking about in relationship to the ineffable, which was that when we were talking about Mars, my favorite Norman Mailer book, and Mailer's one of my favorite authors. I love most of his books, so to pick the pinnacle is difficult. But he wrote this one book in 1969 called Fire on the Moon. And he was commissioned by, I forget if it was Time or Life magazine, to basically go and cover the Apollo 11 mission. And, Mailer was kind of equal parts, novelist and journalist. And he was able to ride an image between those things like no one else. And the magazine really felt very strongly that it would actually take a profound fiction writer to be able to accurately cover the kind of historical weight of something like that. And there's this really beautiful section. The entire thing from cover to cover is just exquisite writing. But there's a big section, I think, kind of toward the middle, where he's talking about the psychology of astronauts. And he's writing this, of course, before they've come back. So a lot of it is speculative because, they're not coming, they haven't yet come back with that kind of first-hand account of what it's actually like to sit, like on the end of a missile, essentially, and get launched out of Earth's orbit and, never know if you're coming home and, all of this kind of stuff. And one of the things he talks about is the kind of fundamental contradictions that were really emblematic of the century, which was that simultaneously, they're men, by the way, who have to somehow negotiate between the kind of precision and unrelenting reality of technology, meaning that they're being forced to deal with questions that have to have answers, or they die or other people die, that there are definitive procedures that have to be followed to the T. And on the other side of that, there's this kind of huge metaphysical set of questions that are being asked that can't be answered. Like the decision to risk one's life, potentially, very likely, to somehow advance human knowledge and human experience. They're going up into space and then coming back basically into suburban Houston. I mean, how you even put those two worlds together is, I don't know, maybe they're more similar than they seem to be, but, so for whatever reason, I was thinking about how important it is for us to actually have questions that can be answered, that are persistently ineffable. And that they're sort of like an itch, right? It's kind of this continuous itch that forces us to either change the way that we ask a question, or to shift the question slightly, or to abandon them for a while, and maybe they cycle back, 150 years later. And I think that that's where the initial kind of prompt came from. I mean, it's no secret that David is a kind of real hero of mine. He kind of saved me in graduate school. And he does really talk a lot about how, we make all these presumptions that within scholarly circles, we talk about something for particular reasons and then stop talking about it because, we've exhausted the subject matter. We suddenly know everything there is to know about Jackson Pollock and therefore don't need to talk about it anymore. And he just says this is total bullshit. Like, we stop talking about Jackson Pollock at some moment because we get bored. And maybe we start talking about it again because some newfangled kid comes around 30 years later and has some new idea about how to look at Jackson Pollock again, and kind of, hit the refresh button on the conversation. And I think that the same thing is true in design disciplines, that we take on a certain kind of fascination with something either because of, the cultural pressures of the moment, or that enough people build up a kind of constituency of interest around a certain set of ideas. And that's sort of like where we focus our eyeballs for a while. And then eventually, some other bright shiny thing kind of comes along and steals our attention, and we look at that for a while, right? So it's never really that things become irrelevant in any absolute sense. It's again like the way that we make decisions about how to spend our time and what to spend our time on, and how to value them. And so it's interesting to then try and have a conversation about things that might fall slightly outside of that, and how do we decide, if we haven't talked about this thing in 300 years, or we've never talked about it because it's emergent for whatever reason. How do we choose to value it so that we're not just sort of putting someone to shame for even daring to bring it up?
Heather wanted to.
Yeah, go for it.
I'll try and be politically correct.
Or don't.
Well, wait. So it's been, I've thoroughly enjoyed the day. I wasn't sure what to expect. The presentations introduced me to ways of thinking about design that I had never thought of before. Really, really interesting. I did not attend yesterday, just today. Something that is very unsettling to me about the presentations that I saw when I looked through the book and did my calculations, roughly 90% of the presenters, if not 100, are trained as architects. They have an architecture degree. And so I wonder what's up with that? And how do you shift that? And I think that this symposium is an enormous undertaking by the Interiors Department at Woodbury to attempt to do that and to empower their interior architecture students to chart academic territory and intellectual territory. But if we look at the ratios today, we're not there yet. And I'm just curious to know how you think we get there.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the queasy thing that we live with all the time. It's part of the reason we started the MIA program, actually. And so part of the answer to your question is purely functional, which is that there are so few graduate degrees in interior architecture. I mean, there's starting to be more. But when we were doing our kind of comparables research, the next closest program was in Phoenix, right? Like there wasn't. So I think a lot of it is this kind of false choice between inside and outside. It's never made any sense to me, and I think it's just because of the way that my brain is wired. And so it just, I've been on reviews at schools in this city where I bring up issues of interiority, and I can still be a pariah. You know, it's like, I mean, literally, I've been like not invited back, and I've been, and then, you know, the studio instructor will like turn to all the students and say like, you need to ignore everything she just said. I mean, and literally, I've had this happen. It's like totally insane. And this goes back to this notion of threat. Like, why is that so deeply threatening? It's like, it's the fundamental precondition of architecture. It's why we do it, right? And so, you know, we get a bit queasy, like especially when we have like our CETA accreditation is coming up this fall, and you know, you have to enumerate how many faculty you have that are accredited under the kind of interior architecture, kind of interior design accrediting bodies, and then you know what your educational backgrounds are, and of course, almost all of us have MArcs. You know, and it's like, cool. But the problem is that there are such measly alternatives at the moment, and so then the question is, okay, well, how do we generate alternatives, and what do they look like, and how are they any different than going and getting an MArc, and how do you know, will people be attracted to that? You know, like, do we build a program and then no one wants to come, right? So it's like the anti-Field of Dreams problem. And I think we're always wrestling with this. And certainly, you know, at kind of like at IDEC and the kind of interior architecture kind of professional conferences, there's always this kind of this struggle to try and figure out, like, do we actually have our own canon? Is it basically just a kind of revisionist history of the architectural canon, or do we actually have a distinct one that's our own? Can we claim one? Do we even want to do that? You know, it's so you know we kind of like live this in our bones all the time, and I think what's exciting is that again, like they're unstable questions, which asks us to be. We have to do a lot of advocating that I don't necessarily think always has to happen in architecture. I think that there are these givens that no one questions, and I feel like we never can do that. Like we're never on terra firma.
Ignore everything she just said. We have a couple of papers, which is great, but I just wanted to quickly, maybe I'll be a second, or you know what, you go first. I'll give you my mic.
So I'm going to have the because I'm trained as an architect, I do not identify as an architect. So, and it's after years and years and years of operating in the interior, realizing that intimate within the envelope is where I thrive, where I get it, where I go. So I'd like to change the conversation that just because you have an architecture degree doesn't mean you're not. See, I feel like I get pushed into a definition that it's like, I married an architect, right? But I'm not an architect. So, you know, when I just went through CETA accreditation, you know, I'm in trouble because I don't have NCIQ. So, and, you know, all those things, and there's a functionalist thing, but I think this kind of forum should, you know, open all those definitions out, you know, up. And even though you're an architect doesn't mean you can't do interiors. And I also think there's an education that happens in an architecture school that's more predetermined towards being an educator that we're up against. And I think that's our job as educators, to make students want to teach as desperately as our professors did. So it's, I mean, we talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing too is that this gets back to the kind of instability. There are historical moments where I could maybe be considered an architect, a mortician, and a poet, and no one would have batted an eye. But these three things are kind of held in common as like how I spend my time.
Wasn't it saucy wench?
And a saucy wench. I'd gladly be a saucy wench, actually.
I wanted to add something to the conversation that's happening right now, that one of the things I loved about this conference was the words that the authors came up with for each of the sections. And these are words that you would not normally use in architecture, and I think that was one thing that was so enticing about this. And it begins to talk about the canon. Deborah Schneiderman actually was giving a definition, started giving a definition of interiors as temporary and reflecting the inhabitants, which then begged the question that when, as an architect, it would be, we have the hubris of thinking of our work as permanent and reflecting ourselves, which of course begs the question of agency, which is a whole other conversation. But let me throw out some heresy here, and as the acting dean, this is something that I've been working with our new director of communications, Eric Baldwin, I'm looking at him right now. What is the story of interior architecture? Is that even the right term? Because it already suggests, should it be interior design? Should it be interiority? Words matter, we know that. And so the word itself, interior architecture, suggests a conditional condition, that it doesn't have its own identity, that it already is qualified in some way. So I would just throw that out to you.
If I may butt in here, and I'm the farthest away from a specialist, if that entity exists in the field of interior architecture. To me, it's a sort of like a destabilizing notion, right? So I actually would insist on the denomination. I love the idea of calling oneself interior architect because it's already a piece, right? And I think that we've had presentations here that were audacious precisely in redrawing the parameters of design and making disciplines going on a limb, right? So I think that the destabilizing power that the designation has is something to sort of like hold on to. Especially, in the normative, connection with architecture proper, whatever proper means.
I'm a landscape architect. So we have the same, there's a descriptor in front of that kind of foundational, I would say, body of work. So I have several friends who are both building architects and landscape architects. You don't usually have to say I'm a building architect.
Right? I wanted to say something. I'm a third-year interior architect student at Woodbury, and I think that interior architecture is the right name. To be honest with you, what drew me to the program, besides the landscape at Woodbury, was the fact that we were not interior design. We were not architects, but we were the happy medium between the two that really immerses the user in all of the senses. And I think in architecture, and this can be debated and whatnot, but I think that there's a distance between the user and the space and the building, because you can go through and above and below and around, but I think that, especially when we're talking about the political aspects of how interiors are different, for the user, I think that we really immerse the user into maybe the political architecture behind a space, or I just feel like I really think that we as Woodbury students and as everyone in this interior architecture program is developing the identity behind it. And the beauty is that all of our professors at Woodbury, which was the second aspect that I loved about the school, was that everyone's from so many different disciplines, which allows for us as interior architects to really have so much pull and so many different perspectives as to where we're going to take this field. So that's my little take on that, and I feel like we are branding ourselves now between all of you guys back there who are active and all of the young ones now that are just beginning and not knowing what they're getting into, and people like myself who are developing our thesis that will develop concepts that I don't think have been in the architecture or the interior design field. So
thank you all so much for an amazing symposium. And I'm really honored to have you all in my learning right now.
There's a book by Arthur Danto, the philosopher and aesthete. It's titled The Transfiguration of the Commonplace. So it's funny because whatever that turns out to me, it signifies some kind of intrusion into how we are and into the human condition. And so from the smallest details like Heather's handwriting, which I urge you to experience in the first person, to the transformational education that you're referring to, I think that there is a paradigm that we've fought hard for in the past probably 100 years that has to do with, unlocking some of these strict dichotomies, challenging positivist thinking. I always like to say that positivists make bad numbers, and I'm not saying this from experience, I can just project into the potential boredoms. I don't get bored easily, but a dichotomy is an invitation for stasis, right? And so the opposite of it, the ecstasy, and I mean, Paulette's presentation, that the particular, the sort of the flirtatious, right? That field of danger that exists between us and the world. There's that, electricity. That has over so many ages has been left unaccounted for, right? I mean, feminism is so young. That's preposterous, right? And so I think we live in an era of activating these, liminal conditions, these truly interesting, last night I wanted to pose a question to our writer, set designer, and artist, and it was going to be a question about human interest. Basically, how do you pull us in? What do you have us, is there a trick? Is there a strategy? Or is it just some empathetic intuition? And it turned out to be the third. So I managed to talk to all three of them, and all three of them said this, privately after, the presentations and ended, and all three of them said, no, I just assumed that people would care. Right? So it's so perverse that we assume that people would care, and yet we do our best to set these normative distinctions that set us apart, that make Annie, basically paint Annie into the architect corner, right? I'm a philosopher, but I do enjoy architecture, and I read a lot about it, and I have strong opinions about Frank Gehry's buildings. And so all the better, right? I mean, not in terms of my contribution, but in terms of the nexus that makes possible. And Heather was mentioning the ineffable, the sort of like that, the stuff that we're grasping at, but we're barely in touch with. And I feel that the exploration of everything that is, too thin to hold on to, but essential to our, relationship with each other in the world is a very potent space. And I think that, most of our presentations, actually all of our presentations today have explored in such a fruitful way.
Any other heckles?
All right, amazing. So first of all, maybe everyone who's an interior architecture student or has graduated from that program to just raise their hand. Yeah. So I'm going to say something, and I'm wondering if you guys agree with me. That I guess one thing I've learned about the conversation between interior and architecture is that, I don't know that there needs to be a delineation, because I've had studios with architect students, and I've designed urban scale, and I've also designed chairs. And so it doesn't feel like there needs to be that big separation. I know there's this identity thing of we're interior architecture, let's have just as big of an identity as architecture, but I think they need to meld really nicely together, because that's how I feel like my education has been at Woodbury, and I like that a lot. It's like Shemaine was saying, it's not, we're not just interior designers, we're both. And I would like to see that happen in the professional world. And I think it's happening already. It is. We're kind of the medium between the two.
we're like bridging the gap, I think. And so all of us combined together make a space a real space. It all makes sense.
I love the handling.
98, 99, interior urbanism with the same issues, the issues of the discipline, if you can create a discipline about this. But the biggest challenge is that you cannot practice interior architecture unless you're an architect, literally out in the world. And yeah, licensing and et cetera, but that is a focus, certainly a focus of architecture. I don't know if Catherine Beckonings, I don't know, Bolkos, am I pronouncing the name correctly? It's great, maybe she'd like to speak to this. I actually have a complete faux pas she just mentioned. She mentioned earlier that her program, she's chair of interior design at CCA, and she mentioned that it previously had been named interior architecture. I said, you went back. Well, I don't know if you have any comments, Catherine.
Thank you. It's a much longer story than that. I'm actually sitting next to the former chair of interior architecture who was trying to make it or change the name to environmental design. Right? So I think this issue of disciplinarity, I think we can separate. When I hear the students talk about it, it's really content-based, right? They're really reflecting on what they're learning how to do and what they're really interested in exploring. And I feel like that should be unlimited. But I want to second Linda's comment about the profession. And professions are legally determined. And the reason why we changed from interior architecture to interior design was because interior design reflected the expansiveness of the content that we were teaching. And it didn't limit our students or make them feel like they were doing a subset of a larger discipline, which I think, when you attach words, I don't think it's as much of an issue in landscape. Is there a difference between landscape design and landscape architecture that's as fraught with, emotional and legal aspects as the difference between interior architecture and interior design? I don't think so. Is it the same? I mean, are there legal?
Yes, it's from the United States, and landscape designers are not. Yeah. It's a licensing issue. It's that's a professional distinction where certain activities are only allowed if you are a landscape architect. So I think it's very, very solid.
So, in that regard, I think that, our decision to stay as an interior design degree was to validate that profession and to acknowledge that it was a scope of exploration and intensity that was culturally distinct from architecture, that speaks to the human scale, speaks to the user interface, feelings, everything that we were talking about today, and rather than diminish it, in the tradition of a male-dominated profession, which architecture is, to elevate it to a discipline that actually embraced the things that architecture consistently tries to repress. And I think, what we talked about today is a really, just a testament to that, right? Like, things that are unmentionable in an architectural discourse are embraced in an interior design discourse. And so for that reason, at CCA, we really made the decision to embrace that term. And I'm trained as an architect also, and the condition that you described and the condition that Heather described is the same at CCA. But as chair, I tried to bring more interior designers into the fold, taking advantage of a kind of loophole that said that if you have 12 years or more of professional experience, that's the equivalent of a master's.
And so we're surrounded by interior designers who say, hey, you know, clients hate their architects and really don't want to pay them, but they open bank accounts for their interior designers and they're their best friends. And, you know, kind of say things, again, that would be unmentionable in an architecture department. So, I don't know if that sheds any light on that, or I said unmentionable. I have to really commend all the organizers of the conference for this environment of safety, of nurturing, of philosophical discussion, I think, at the end, the kind of questions, you know, what's more true? Like some idea about truth, or the thing that most people believe?
I think so Teddy Roosevelt was just up on the screen, which signals that we're actually at the end of our hour. Teddy Roosevelt dressed as a girl, actually, as a small child. So Teddy in drag. So I think, Catherine, actually, your comment is a really great place for us to segue into drinking. And so we're gonna unravel rather than like tie it all together. We'll tie one on. So thank you to everyone. It's been a really wonderful day and a half.
There is a reception that's going to happen outside there with some past appetizers and stuff like that. So please stay and continue a conversation. I was told that if you were in the parking, or if you're in the parking right now, you need to just move your car before 7 o'clock. The enclosed one is out here. And also, we're going to start out with a soundtrack that will be playing soon over there by our colleague from Spatial Affairs. And everything that he had curated is unmentionable. So,